Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's program commemorating the 50th anniversary of Ms. Magazine. Since its founding in 1972, Ms. Magazine has been a source for news, analysis, and commentary with a feminist point of view. To celebrate the 50th anniversary, Ms. has published this beautiful new book that is a greatest hits selection of some of the most groundbreaking pieces that Ms. has published on women, men, politics, family, education, work, and reproductive rights, as well as the best of the magazine's fiction, poetry, and letters. The book features essays by Billie Jean King, Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Nancy Pelosi, Bell Hooks, and Joy Harjo, as well as fiction and poetry by Toni Morrison, Joyce Carol Oates, and Adrienne Rich, and Sharon Olds, among others. Sorry, just made a little error there. Now, just to remind everyone, back in 1973, when Gloria Steinem founded Ms. Magazine, Nixon was president, Robert Bork was the Attorney General, former Nazi Kurt Waldheim was Secretary General of the United Nations. Ferdinand Marcos, Mao Zedong, Idi Amin, and Brezhnev were all in power. Angela Davis was in jail. The Vietnam War was raging. And Amy Coney Barrett was born. Boy, did we ever need Ms. Magazine. Ms. was the first U.S. magazine to feature prominent American women demanding the repeal of laws that criminalized abortions, advocated for the Equal Rights Amendment, rated presidential candidates on women's issues, and the first to feature stories on domestic violence and sexual harassment on its cover, and to commission and publish a national study on date rape. Now, for all the younger people in the audience, I also just want to throw out there that while this might seem like ancient history to you, it's really actually all quite recent. In fact, when my shiro, Dolores Huerta, co-founded the National Farm Workers Association in 1960, she would not have legally been able to open up a checking account or apply for a mortgage just because she was a woman. In many states, she also would not have had legal access to birth control. In fact, my own mother, who lived in Connecticut in 1962, had to travel across state lines to purchase birth control. And it wasn't until 1965 that birth control became legal throughout the United States. And at that time, you had to be married to get it. It wasn't until 1972, the year before Ms. Magazine was founded, that single women were allowed access to birth control, if you can believe it. And yet, just last year, in his opinion, revoking the constitutional right to abortion, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas actually stated that now the Supreme Court should reconsider its past rulings codifying rights to access to contraception, as well as to having same-sex relationships, not to mention same-sex marriages. So clearly these issues are just as relevant today as they were then. And by the way, it wasn't until 1974 that women were allowed to open bank accounts in their own name without their husband's permission. Feeling a little feminist rage right now. So, having this magazine to bring all of these civil and human rights issues to light and to advocate for women is and was really critical. On tonight's panel, we'll look back on the legacy of Ms. and the future of feminism with the executive editor of Ms. Magazine, Katherine Spillar, Ellie Smeal, the co-founder of the Feminist Majority Foundation, which publishes Ms. Magazine, Carmen Rios, consulting digital editor for Ms., Michele Bratcher Goodwin, author and host of the Ms. podcast On the Issues, and labor rights organizer and women's rights champion, Dolores Huerta. It's an amazing, amazing lineup. And after the panel, our wonderful speakers will all be available to sign copies of the new Ms. book out in the Hammer Courtyard, so please join us for that. And now it's my honor to introduce Katherine Spillar. Kathy Spillar is the executive editor of Ms. Magazine and co-founder and executive director of the Feminist Majority. Spillar has been a driving force in executing both organizations' diverse programs, securing women's rights domestically and globally. In addition to overseeing the editorial content of the magazine and website, she edited the wonderful book, 50 Years of Ms. She also advocates for women on the world stage and has appeared on NPR's Morning Edition, 60 Minutes, The Rachel Maddow Show, Fresh Air with Terry Gross, CNN, ABC News, CBS News, NBC, Politically Incorrect, Tavis Smiley, and Hannity and Colmes. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the executive director of Ms. Magazine, Kathy Spillar.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. And I want to thank Annie Philbin and the great team of hers here at the Hammer. Just an incredible evening tonight. So in addition to this event, we are organizing more than 30 events across the country to bring together local feminist communities to explore paths forward during this time of tremendous backlash and rising authoritarianism here in the United States and around the world. The collection of articles in this book shows how the movement has grown over the last 50 years. It shows how the issues of women's equality, the problems that women face, both here in the US and globally, have evolved over the last 50 years. The articles selected show also the tremendous impact that Ms. has had, its prescience, and its future necessity as a roadmap for equality. For all of its 50 years, it has been a touchstone of the feminist movement, not just reporting the news, but often making it, popularizing ideas, sparking laws, and even creating new vocabulary, setting trends, and launching new scholarship. The power of the feminist movement is its ideas, and Ms. has worked to amplify and spread those ideas. Ms. has always offered its readers and the larger feminist community strategies for changing our present, and hopes for the future. And Ms. remains as critical today as ever as the attacks on women's rights and threats to our very democracy intensify. So with that, I want to introduce tonight's panelists who are joining us. Carmen Rios. Carmen is the consulting digital editor at Ms. and a former managing digital editor for the magazine. She's a feminist writer, broadcaster, community builder, whose pieces on queerness, gender, race, and class have been published on everything from BuzzFeed to the National Women's History Museum, Signs, the Journal, and Women's Media Center. She's produced and hosted popular feminist podcasts, including Propaganda and The Bossy Show. Carmen. Dolores Huerta. Dolores is a member of the Ms. Advisory Board and of the board of the Feminist Majority Foundation, which, as you heard, publishes Ms. Magazine. She is the founder and president of the Dolores Huerta Foundation. She was co-founder with Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers Union. She remains a pillar of the civil, labor, LGBTQ+, and the women's rights communities. She's a leader in anti-poverty efforts and community organizing. Dolores was named as Ms. Magazine's one of 3 most important women in 1997, and in 2012, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. Dolores Huerta. Michele Goodwin is the executive producer of Ms. Studios and a frequent contributor to Ms., whose work appears in the 50 Years of Ms. collection. She is the Linda D. and Timothy J. O'Neill Professor of Constitutional Law and Global Health Policy at Georgetown University. She previously held the Chancellor's Professorship at the University of California, Irvine, where she founded and directed its Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy and its Reproductive Justice Initiative. Michele is an award-winning author and journalist and an advisor on matters related to law, society, and global health. Michele Bratcher Goodwin. And Ellie Smeal, who is a co-founder and president of the Feminist Majority Foundation and one of the leading architects of the modern drive for women's equality. Ellie is a political analyst, strategist, and grassroots organizer. She has led efforts for the economic, political, and social equality and empowerment of women worldwide for more than 4 decades, including the original drive to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And of course, she continues to be a leading strategy in the movement to ensure the ERA is finally added to the Constitution. Please welcome Ellie Smeal. So we're going to get started here. My first question to all of you is pretty similar. It is whether you can remember when you first read Ms. Magazine, and if you can remember, what it has meant to you as a feminist. Carmen, going to start with you.
Sure. As I've been asked this question at different stops along the book tour, I've realized that my feminist journey is really completely intertwined with my first sighting of Ms. in the wild, which was, I was always a feminist. I was raised by a single mom, and I always knew that, things were unfair, things needed to be better. So when I was looking at colleges, I wanted something political, something activist. And so when I went to American University and saw a feminist group tabling with these free issues of Ms., I was like, well, I have to go here. These are the lengths that I would go for free issues of Ms. At that time. And, that ended up being the beginning of everything else, really. FMF was my first feminist internship. I worked with the organizers later on as the leader of that group to bring those magazines to campus. And just as we say at FMF, once you're in, you can never leave. So I've stayed throughout so many different positions and iterations and opportunities to engage with Ms. and Feminist Majority Foundation. And so it's just a really central part of my feminist journey. My story is really wrapped up in it.
And we love you for it. Michele, I'm coming to you next with that question. When you first read Ms. and how it's impacted you.
Well, I read Ms. Magazine as a very precocious kid, right alongside other media that touched my life, which would include Ms., Ebony, and Jet, and then later on Essence. But those magazines that brought an important narrative and storytelling, fact-telling that otherwise wouldn't have been presented in other news, just simply wasn't. And sadly, actually, that continues to be the case largely today. But that was as a child. Those were the magazines that were important, that were understood as being important. You had to read the others and they would come into the house, but the ones that told the stories that didn't get told were Ms., Jet, and Ebony altogether.
Thank you. Dolores, I'm going to ask it a little bit differently for you. I know that when you were organizing the Great Boycott in New York, you met Gloria Steinem. And you said that meeting her really changed your life and changed the way you do organizing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I thought I knew what feminism was. My mother, she divorced my dad. She was a businesswoman. I raised myself, my two brothers. She was a very good businesswoman, very active in the community. So I thought I knew what feminism was, okay? But I didn't, okay? Like many women, we didn't realize that feminism also has to do with controlling your body, something about your sex life, the fact that you can not only be a leader in your community like my mother was, but we have to go far beyond that. And, traveling with Gloria, and I have to say this too, I also have to give tribute to Ellie here. As many of you may know, I am the mother of 11 children. And having been raised a Catholic, and as many Latina women and other women also, I was also raised with the idea that abortion is a sin, okay? And it took conversations with Gloria Steinem and later on with Ellie for me to transition from just thinking of women as being dominant people in their families and maybe leaders, community leaders, but to make it much more than that. That we as women had to fight for our own bodies, and that it was okay, that abortion was okay, that it wasn't a mortal sin and you're not going to go to hell, right? As we were taught. But it took that and that empowerment. And of course, a lot of that came from this magazine also. Because I think as women are going through that process and trying to get rid of these cultural traditions that have held women down for so many centuries, and we have to break through that. And it's not only a psychological break, I think, but it's also an emotional break. And when Ms. Magazine is right there and you're reading this and say, it's okay. It's okay for you to claim your identity as a woman, your identity as a leader. And here it is in writing, and this is like the blueprint. This is the way that you do it, okay? And so for me, I have to say it was a liberating experience, and I think that's what that is. And Ms. Magazine does that for women. It's a liberating experience, and I am forever grateful to Ellie Smeal here, and to Gloria Steinem, and to all of the great women, and especially to Ms. Magazine.
Thank you, Dolores. Ellie, I'm going to ask it yet a different way for you. What was your thinking when Gloria Steinem came to the Feminist Majority Foundation in 2001 and said, would we take on publishing of Ms. Magazine? We had no background in journalism. We had never published a magazine. Our background was in activism. But tell us why Feminist Majority decided to take it on.
Well, when she called me and suggested this, I said, well, we're not the right ones. And I was particularly concerned because there's a Miss Foundation, and that seemed more suitable. It had the same name, the whole thing. No, she said, I really think you guys are the ones. And I said, I don't see this. Anyway, we would argue back and forth, not argue, discuss it. And basically, it kept up. She raised a whole campaign. I mean, it wasn't just me. She made sure people called us and said, this is a good idea. And all that. Then when we start really thinking about it, we said, what are we, crazy? I mean, it was a time when not only newspapers were going under, but magazines were going under. It's like, how are we going to do this when we know the math of it did not work? But anyway, we decided after talking about it, what else are we going to do? We're not going to let them close Ms. Magazine. It wouldn't look good for the feminist movement. So we got to keep it going. And besides, it was Gloria Steinem asking us to. Why not? I mean, so we literally said, I think it was Peg Yorkin, and I would always pay tribute to Peg Yorkin. She was our chair of the board. She just passed this year. We terribly miss her. And she always would cut it to the bottom. She said, what are we agonizing on? We know we're going to do this. And her language was always more salty than that. She said, let's just cut to the chase and do it and find out how much it's going to cost us. Now, by the way, I want to answer that first question about what did you do when it first came out? I was president of the Pennsylvania Now, okay? And we need an organizing tool, and we loved it. But what we thought about is how do we keep it in the front of the stands, the book stands? So they have all these other magazines, especially very sexist magazines. So we would go in and move it to the front. Anyway, it was always activism that counts.
That's exactly right. So Ms. is much bigger than the magazine today. We still publish the magazine quarterly, distributed in bookstores, on newsstands, to our members, and we also distribute it free to women's conferences of all kinds and to women in prison. We provide Ms. Magazine to over 5,000 women who are in prison. But Carmen, thank you. We're also on the web. I mean, we have a very vibrant website. Over 3 million people read our website on a regular basis. We have over 500,000 followers on various social media platforms. You were part of the transition to this current iteration of the website, and we very strategically not only designed it, but also how we keep the content on there so vibrant and current. Will you address that?
Sure. I mean, it was an exciting project for me. I always, I sort of come into feminism always thinking digital first. My background was sort of in digital feminism. I think it was really just sort of emerging when I was getting started. And I saw so many gaps online in where feminist conversations were missing. And then I also, came to Ms. and just saw this incredibly rich legacy and history, and that there was so much potential for what we could do with the website on social media. And so we took on this massive redesign project that would allow us to, I think back and we really were equipping ourselves for the onslaughts that would come shortly after, but just making sure that it was a space where we could do what Ms. does best more often, to reach more people and to platform more voices. And so, we have everything on there, from global to domestic, from politics to pop culture, that would fill sort of those gaps in the news cycle that a quarterly magazine can't possibly keep up with in, today's age. And so we were able to, form new collaborations and coalitions, bring content to the fore from feminist groups and organizations, pieces from feminist thought leaders and movement leaders, and to be able to work with stables of emerging feminist writers and feminist scholars, and just create this, what I always thought of was when I saw that issue of Ms., and I know this is so many people's experience, to feel like these are my people. You see it on someone's coffee shop, you see it in the front of the newsstand, you see it in someone's tote bag on, the train, and you're thinking, that person knows me, sees me, understands me. And I wanted Ms. to be a place where young feminists and the feminists who had been with us from the very start could come together and keep learning, keep exploring, and be more connected to, actions they could take, more immediate responses that they could have to what was happening to their communities and around them and on a national and global scale. And so we do that. And then, of course, we embark on our new era of bringing on some social media staff that are dedicated to making sure we're getting those incredible pieces out there. And it's just been magnificent watching it grow in the years since. And it's now, we have multiple newsletters and so much content on there. And once again, we're reporting on the trends with a gender analysis, with a gender lens that is so often missing. And we're also setting those trends and starting those conversations. When I was looking through the archives recently of just what I had published in those years, it's like we had, dozens of pieces coming out during the Kavanaugh hearings, dozens of pieces coming out about, the Muslim ban and every Supreme Court justice that had been appointed over the last couple of years. And it's just so many voices were able to come together, just like in this collection, to tell the plain truth about what was happening.
Exactly. And Michele, we're also podcasting. You joined our leadership team in 2020. You're the executive producer of Ms. Studios, including host of the podcast On the Issue. What's on the horizon for Ms. Studios?
Thank you.
And why did you come to Ms. to start your podcast?
So thank you so much for that question, because I had been approached about hosting podcasts and other things, and busy across a number of different sectors and in the news quite a bit. And I thought about coming to Ms. with a podcast because I thought that there could be no better place to be able to have a discussion, elevate issues and concerns that wouldn't be edited out, that wouldn't be sanitized, that wouldn't have been at the end not making it to the public square, which happens so much with discourse that people just simply don't realize. It's not that at major news media there aren't great people, women who have great ideas, feminists at all sorts of places, but it's not necessarily that their ideas will consistently be greenlit. And so in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, I called Kathy and I said, we ought to do a podcast. And Kathy was right on board, that she had been thinking about there being a podcast. And then we decided, okay, let's do this and let's figure out the stories that we think will be important and need to be told. And so this was a very cerebral endeavor at the very beginning of it, just as we would talk and think it through and sketch it out. What are the narrative stories that need to be told, or told in a different way? And as it turned out, what we had sketched out for the first 6 months to a year, and I will tell you very quickly, we rose to be in the top 2% of all podcasts. And people were contacting us, members of Congress, their staff, we want to get on the podcast. Will you not get? And we would have to say, well, you can get on the podcast, but it's going to be 6 months from now, 7 months from now. But to just give you an idea of the way in which we thought conversations needed to be shaped and get out, we early on thought, okay, we want to do something on police violence, but we want to have women leading that conversation. And amongst them, people that you don't hear about in police, like women police chiefs, officers. And it turned out that we had scheduled this first episode to launch weeks ahead. And it turned out when it launched right alongside the horror of George Floyd's murder. And we had 4 women talking about it, including one of the people on that episode. You'll not believe this, but I mean, Kathy and I was just like, we were hitting things before they were happening. And one of them is a filmmaker who had just spent the last 2 years working on a film where? Minneapolis. Tracking the Minneapolis Police Department. Minneapolis has had one of the first women police chiefs in the country. And so here it is, before George Floyd had been murdered, Breonna Taylor, all of that, we had thought we need to have this conversation. We need to have these women in the conversation, and then there it is. We also did the same January 6th. We said we need a series on the dismantling of democracy, the challenges to democracy in this country, what it means in terms of voter suppression. We were talking about months before, in March, what's going to happen if Trump says he won the election and he didn't? We were talking about that 10 months before, 8, 9 months before, and setting up a series of discussions about that. We had people on that episode in that series that later came into the Justice Department working on these very issues. So anyway, that's some of the background, and we've got great podcasts coming forward on binging banned books, on the First Amendment, your favorite book authors coming on to tell the stories of their books with the people that they're interviewing, just really great ones, and one that we're going to launch that's about our bodies, our minds, and so forth. So keep listening. Keep paying attention, because hopefully we'll find many different ways to reach you, your friends, and the people you love and care about.
And it's very exciting, the programming. Dolores, I want to come back to you. When we are putting together each issue of Ms. or we're publishing articles on the website, always we're thinking, how can this information be used in organizing and activism? We view Ms. as a bridge between the ideas that are being generated by this movement in all different sectors and the activists who are doing the work on the ground to make change for social progress and social justice. Do you use what's in Ms. in your organizing? The Dolores Huerta Foundation is doing all kinds of civic engagement, community organizing. Tell us if it is and what you've used.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for that question. Often people think of farm workers, and when they think of farm workers, they don't think of women, and they think of men being farm workers. And there was one article that came out in Ms. Magazine that had such an impact. In my organizing with farm workers, there are stories that are so atrocious that it's hard to believe them. I know one of the companies we were organizing just before Caesar passed away, and women told these stories. I remember one woman saying, all of the crew of women said, every one of us, they have asked us, they said in Spanish, las nalgas, which means, your butt, pretty much, Every single woman in this crew has been hit upon, every woman. There were women that had to meet with the labor contractor or the foreman before the harvest, meet them at a motel somewhere to have sex so they could have a job. There were women that had babies from some of these labor contractors or foremen, actually had to have a child from them to make sure that they had the security of a job. And the sexual harassment is just rampant. And trying to get these women to come forward, we have laws in the state of California. We have laws at the federal level that women do not have to put up with this. But there was so much fear for their own safety, fear for their families. If I get fired, that means my husband gets fired, the whole family gets fired, none of us will be able to work. A fear that they are going to accuse me of being the temptress, to bring on all of this sexual harassment, So trying to get women to come forward and say, you've got to do this, because if we don't speak up, this will continue. Well, there was an article in Ms. Magazine called The Green Motel. The Green Motel. And finally, one of these women came forward. She had suffered, actually years of being raped and sexually harassed by this one particular foreman. So she came forward. She finally went, and somebody, gave her the courage to go to the company. The company didn't do anything about it. So they finally got her to sue, and she won a huge settlement. And that article, The Green Motel, that came out in Ms. Magazine, gave so many women, farm worker women, the courage to speak up, to stop this terrible harassment and treatment of the farm worker women. So that is a great tribute, Kathy, and that one helped us so much. So again, thanks to Ms. Magazine.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to turn now to this period in our country that we are living through, this horrific backlash against women's progress in the U.S. It parallels attacks against women's rights in other countries, but I want to focus now on the U.S. and the attacks on women's most fundamental rights. Specifically, I want to talk about the Dobbs decision. Before we turn to the strategies that the movement and grassroots activists are using to fight back, I really do want people here tonight to understand how damaging the decision is. So, Michele, I'd like you to explain, if you can, the philosophy of these originalists on the court, but specifically how the Dobbs decision further eviscerated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause protections for women.
Absolutely. It's a great question, Kathy, and thank you for grounding it in a level setting, because there are ways in which we hear about a case like Dobbs but not really know the texture underneath it. So Dobbs, June 2022, the last day of the court's term, the justices released the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And if you just read mainstream media, you'd think that, well, Roe was a shaky decision. It was one where the court was deeply split. Abortion was always incredibly vulnerable. It would not be true. That's the way in which Justice Alito wrote the opinion, said it was egregiously decided. But to just level set, Roe 1973 was a 7-2 decision, not a split court. 5 of those 7 justices were Republican appointed. The justice who authored the opinion, Justice Blackmun, was not put on the court by a Democrat, some radical liberal. It was put on the court by Richard Nixon. So a Nixon appointee wrote the opinion of Roe and said that it was fundamental to women's ability being able to have a career, have an education, to be able to protect their health, their mental health, that they be allowed to terminate pregnancies. You'd not know that from the Dobbs decision or the way in which Dobbs has been covered. You wouldn't know that in 1973, Justice Blackmun said, abortions have been performed for millennia. Abortions were being performed in the United States and not criminalized. The Pilgrims performed abortion. You would not know that by the Dobbs decision. Dobbs, Alito says it was egregiously decided. What were they thinking? There's nothing rooted in law. You would not know from the Dobbs decision that even before Roe, 30 years before Roe v. Wade, is a case called Skinner v. Oklahoma. It's a 1942 case where the United States Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, says that it is a human right to determine your own reproductive future, that a state may not interfere with it, that it is a civil right. But this involves a man. It's a case that involves a man who's in Oklahoma, and the state of Oklahoma has said, if you are a chicken thief, which he was, you're a chicken thief, and you get caught 3 times, then you can be coercively sterilized. No choices in your reproductive future. In that case, though, in that state, they said, but there is an exception. It's only for the chicken thieves, not for the bank CEOs, not for the people who control your pensions. It's not the same. I mean, an explicit carve out. And so 9-0, the Supreme Court strikes that down on equal protection grounds. You cannot impose upon poor people's reproductive futures, constrain them, and say it's okay for the wealthy to go and do whatever they want. And so then we have Dobbs, where the court claims to be rooting its decision in history, of course, skipping over history as if it's playing jump rope, picking a little bit of history here, a little bit of history there, and leaving out importance of history. The court cites individuals who never made their way to the United States, people who died in Europe, people who supported Salem witch trials and all of that as being the legal foundation for the case, cited individuals, historians who are discredited, who don't even necessarily have PhDs in history, right? And so with us understanding Dobbs and what it's about, I think one critical thing is that in Ms. Magazine, this was being talked about in advance. Like, you know, and even this history with regard to policing and surveilling women's reproduction dating back to the 80s and 90s, and the risks that there could be a Dobbs decision before there was a Dobbs decision that year leading up. So where journalists in New York Times, Washington Post were like, oh, we're surprised. If you had been reading Ms. Magazine, you would have known that, look, this is potentially what's on the horizon and what's going to happen. And the one last thing that I will say is that Dobbs comes out the day after the Bruen decision, the decision where the Supreme Court strikes down a New York gun control law. And what's interesting is that Justice Thomas authors that opinion. And in that opinion, he says, I need to do a prologue. I need everybody to understand, and I'm going to spend 5 paragraphs talking about why it's so important that Black men have access to guns. And he talks about how it's so essential to Black male bodily autonomy. You can't make it up. 5 paragraphs about Black male bodily autonomy being connected to being able to own a gun. And he talks about a Black male professor from 100 years ago who couldn't have a gun. A Black guy who was a music teacher couldn't have a gun. All, you know, and yet you will find one day later in the Dobbs decision, no prologue. You won't even find, and Thomas does do a concurrence, you will not even find any of the justices mentioning Black woman, the 2 words together, Black woman, Black women, none of that. And I think that says a lot about a court and where we are.
Here we are.
Wow.
Scalia did warn us when he explicitly said there is nothing in the Constitution that prevents sex discrimination. And if you want something in it, you got to put it in it. And so, Ellie, it seems that Dobbs has increased the urgency of getting the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. And the feminist movement has been fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment now for over 100 years. Can you bring us up to date on the status of the Equal Rights Amendment and what people can do?
Okay, I'll try to do this fast because it's very simple. We have now ratified the ERA. Say it again, the Equal Rights Amendment is ratified. There are only two requirements in the Constitution. One, that you pass it in 3/4 of the states' legislatures. The governors are given no power, just the state legislatures. Oh, and of course, that it was first proposed by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. So in 71, I was lucky enough, I was there. I started working on the ERA in the Pittsburgh chapter of the National Organization for Women that had ERA task force in 1970. Okay, forget it. 50 years. They go fast these years. Faster now. But anyway, so it's been ratified. The 38th state to ratify, the qualifying was and is Virginia. Okay, so that's happened. then why isn't it recognized? Unfortunately, Mr. Trump, if you want to say Mr., was president. And their legal counsel and essentially writes an opinion, the Office of Legal Counsel writes an opinion saying that it isn't to be ready for an archivist to file it because of the 7-year limitation that was put in the preamble. Now, we have asked so many constitutional lawyers and scholars, and you're one of the scholars that we've asked, over 200 and some, I got lost after I don't know how many, said that doesn't count. And why doesn't it count? Because it's in the preamble, not the resolve clause that what the state legislatures voted on. They had nothing to do with the 7-year. That was just sort of the reasoning behind passing the requirement or passing the proposing the amendment to the states that it was needed. Okay, so unfortunately, they said the exact opposite, this council. Now, where we are, let's just go up fast, is the Biden administration set that decision aside. And they said that it's up to the states, not to the states, to the Congress and the courts. And they purposely let off, didn't say the president. But why? Because, in fact, the president has no power under the amending clause on purpose. They didn't want a dictatorship. They didn't want the contract with the states to be controlled by one person. So basically, where are we now? We are backing 2 resolutions, one in the South in the Senate, one in the House. Actually, it's a little more complicated than that, but the resolution 25 in the House, 4 in the Senate, joint resolution says the Equal Rights Amendment has been ratified. They affirm that statement. And then they say that that essentially that the archivist should go ahead and publish it. I'm doing it real short. But anyway, that resolution was stopped in the Senate, but we got our first roll call vote in the Senate in 40 years. And essentially we have 53 senators, not 23, 53 senators that have said that approved the resolution. In the House, of course, it is controlled by the Republicans, and they won't put it to a vote. So what we are doing there is we have a discharge petition. And a discharge petition is how we started in the first place, because we couldn't get through the Senate in about 40 or 50 years, way back in 71, because one person, the House Judiciary Committee right-winger, wouldn't let it go to the floor. Martha Griffiths, who we should remember her name. I think it's really good that we remember the heroes and heroines of the time. Martha Griffiths, from Detroit, who was wonderful, was a part of the entire putting protection of women at work in Title VII, but I don't want to go on to that. Decided that she wasn't going to let one man stop it, and she went for a discharge petition. That discharge petition, what does it take? It takes 218, the majority of the House, to sign it. And she got it through, and then the Senate ratified it the next year. So we're in a way that where we are right now is we've got to make them, the Senate, the House, discharge it. And by the way, I'm wearing a new button which says it says sign for, and that's the number 4, era.org. Now, what is that about? We want to come alive the polls. We're way ahead in the polls. It's almost embarrassing. The other side has nothing almost. I'm not exaggerating. Among Democrats, it's over 80%. It depends on what you're looking at, but you're looking at 75% of the population, overwhelmingly for, and if you look at young people, that number goes even up higher. So People believed we had equal rights. They now know we don't have it. What the Dobbs decision did is it woke up everybody to say, oh my God, these people can take anything away. And we're going to correct that. And so we are very encouraged right now. We believe we can do this. And that's half of doing it. So I want you all to go to this website and sign up for it. We have 75,000 people. We intend to have millions of people. We're not going to mess around. Not on our watch. This thing is going to be ratified.
So there. All right. So, Michele, in a nutshell, would the ERA give us the basis for recovering abortion rights?
Oh, absolutely. It would, because in a nutshell, it means that women have equal constitutional rights that affirm their bodily autonomy, their privacy, all of those rights that are otherwise articulated in the Constitution that have been perceived to apply only to men historically, and will now put women in the Constitution in ways that are explicit, should have been there already, had been interpreted previously by the Supreme Court in various bit by bit as getting there, but this would take us over the line.
There's another aspect, Michele, I'm going to put you on the spot on this, on the ERA. It could also help us get stronger laws against, to prevent violence against women. Can you give us the elevator one on that?
Absolutely. One of the unfortunate things about some of our laws, and I think it says a lot about history in the United States, is that laws that we think are sacred, that once they're passed, we don't have to think about them again. Think about voting rights. Right, exactly. You think about, well, voting rights, clearly that doesn't have to be reauthorized. It turns out that it does. Violence Against Women Act. You think, like, who would be against, a Violence Against Women Act? Why would we have to relitigate that again? But it turns out that we do. It's not a permanent kind of thing. What our Constitution provides for is the permanence of the kinds of rights that we believe are fundamental, basic human rights, but haven't been ensconced in American law, and where there has been explicit resistance. Because what we've just heard from Ellie, in terms of that fight, why in the world, 2023, are we still having to fight for the equal dignity, the equal human rights, the equal civil liberties and civil rights of women? 2023, and that we could have in the last administration after Virginia, Illinois, Nevada had ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, that you could have a president sitting in office and say, I block that. I demand that the archivist not do the job of that. In these times, and we're not talking about the 1950s or 30s or the 1800s, but in these times that we are still having that basic fundamental fight.
Carmen, I'm going to come to you next. Ms. has always broken the silence on issues that mainstream media really wouldn't touch or barely touched or refused to cover. In its very first issue, Ms. published a petition that led with, "We have had abortions," and it was 50 famous women who signed. At the time, many of them were admitting to having broken the law, because this was 1972, a year before Roe v. Wade, and most states had very restrictive abortion laws on the books. The Washington Post recently concluded that that petition and Ms. had changed the course of the reproductive rights movement, the abortion fight, because it had finally made visible that which had been invisible, which were the women who had had abortions. How else has Ms. shaped, especially when you were with us during the Trump years, the war on women, what else has Ms. been able to do to change the discourse, to change the conversation, to get us more towards our rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's come up a lot that Ms. tends to be prescient, tends to start and add to conversations where, information is missing about how things are impacting women, women of color, poor women, queer women. And I think, that obviously leading into 2016, Ms. was also doing that. Leading into that election, we were sounding the alarm about the balance of the Supreme Court. And I always think back to that because, it's bitterly painful to be able to say, I told you so. But there were just so many things we were saying in the lead up to that election about how critical it was for the judiciary, and up and down, not just the Supreme Court, but all of these vacant court positions. We were talking about the risk to abortion rights. We were talking about, the risks that women of color were going to face, that immigrants were going to face, and people absolutely said we were overreacting, over-exaggerating.
Hysterical.
Yes, hysterical, that we were basically, that we were the ones fear-mongering. And so I think about that often when I'm alone with my thoughts. And, during the Trump years, I think we really saw, like Michele said, these things that we thought were sacred are clearly very easy to destroy and to rupture and to weaken and water down and to just completely take off the table. And I think it was, we were facing this onslaught every single day, news stories, and this sense of hopelessness and futility. It's happening so fast. There's so little control that we have. Like, it felt like we had just sort of lost that ability to push back. And what Ms. was able to do was do what we do best, and we had a weekly feature, a War on Women report on the site where we literally just chronicled in chronological order every single completely absurd, bizarre, frustrating, terrible thing that was happening, and how feminists and organizers and movement leaders were responding. We were obviously able to do real-time reporting. We were there at, the airports during the Muslim ban protests, and we were there able to provide context. I think, in an era when so much feminist media is now emerging, but a lot of legacy feminist media is no longer with us. We've seen, and especially in mainstream media, where feminist history is often non-existent, there's this ability for people, at these large news organizations to act like something like Dobbs comes out of nowhere. What a surprise! No one could have predicted that this would occur. And it's always right there in Ms. that we were predicting it would occur and telling people how to mobilize to make sure it would not. And so during those years of, feeling like there was so little that we could do, we were able to inspire some hope and offer some solace, and then also provide people with really concrete, tangible ways to show up online, in person, every single day. And to just know that we could provide them with information that would have that context, as well as the information they needed about how to respond. And so I think that's been such a critical part of Ms. And when I think about the history of Ms., Claudia touched on some of this, you touched on some of this, but just knowing that, Ms. changed the FBI's definition of rape. Ms. Is why the UN has female genital mutilation on their agenda as an issue they need to talk about and focus on. And, Ms. and FMF have been at the vanguard for so long of fighting for abortion rights, especially with what we're seeing right now is that we're in a new era of abortion restrictions where self-managed abortions are now more available and accessible. And we've played such a huge part, too, in making sure that people have information about mifepristone and mifepristol and organizations that are providing aid to people who need abortion access in states where it's heavily restricted and in countries where it's extremely restricted. And so I think it's just, it's remained a lifeline. And we start those conversations so that we can say we told you so down the line.
And actually, for all the horribleness, there is some good news. So I want to turn to a recent poll that Ms. and the Feminist Majority Foundation sponsored, a national poll with Celinda Lake of Lake Research Partners. And we issued a report, not so subtly titled, and I quote, "The Power of Abortion Rights and the Equal Rights Amendment in Driving the 2024 Elections." So Ellie, I want to turn to you first to talk about the poll's top findings on abortion and women's rights as mobilizing issues. And then, Dolores, I want to come to you for what I think a lot of people will be surprised about the poll. But Ellie, why don't you start?
Yeah,
Get the
encouraging-
mic.
Oh, mic. Little details. Okay. We started with some propositions, but the posters were even shocked that what happens is that abortion is a driving, motivating issue because real people are being affected and suffering from these. Already 25 states have passed restrictions that are terrible, many of them bans. Okay, we understand that. But what we didn't know also, but we suspected it actually, is that when you talk about it in the context that we need the Equal Rights Amendment, we must guarantee the fundamental rights for women. For God's sakes, we're supposed to be the leading democracy in the world in supporting human rights. They're not going to guarantee our own people. Anyway, when you put the two together, it is the second most important combination. It rises to number 2 reason to vote in 2024. And by goodness, we are going to make sure everybody knows the two are connected. Now, one thing I wanted to say why I keep saying it's so close and we can do this, I want to give you another number. We already know that we believe you need 218 to discharge a petition. We know that we have probably 213. We only need 5 votes. Some people count it as 4. It depends on how you count. Okay. In the Senate, we have the votes. We got to make sure that they get a bigger leadership, that we get a solid majority in both houses, and a president who's for the Equal Rights Amendment, not a president that we wonder which is the next lawsuit that's going to throw him in jail. But anyway, so basically, it's doable, and it's important. And what I think is so good about the poll, it shows that all kinds of people think the two are necessary. And the numbers are very, very high. I said about young people, but among women, we even have a tie vote among Republican women. Among Democratic women, it's off the charts, but Democratic men, it's off the charts. It's over 80%. This is not close. We just got to deliver that election or do it right before the election when there are some of those so-called middle-level, moderate Republicans wake up and come on that discharge petition and get it out of both houses before the election.
We're determined to get this word out because if you just listen to the general media and you read the various papers we all read, you think the only thing that matters is rising prices or inflation. In fact, when you ask the questions that dig in, which Ms. is famous for, Ms. and the Feminist Majority Foundation, you find that, as Ellie said, the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion together rise to the second most important issue. And we found the same thing last fall, especially among young women. It was the only thing they were going out to vote on. Women under 30, it was the only issue they cared about. And it's a decisive voting group. But it shows you how the media is not reporting that, and so you would think, well, you know, I'm out of the mainstream. It's not an important issue. The media keeps reporting that abortion has faded as an issue, and they were very surprised in 2022 the outcome of those elections, and I think they will be again. And one of the big surprises in the poll, I think, Dolores, is where Latinas were. On abortion, on the Equal Rights Amendment. Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Absolutely. People don't realize how the browning of America is happening, okay? I think right now in our country, we have like 59% of people are now considering themselves Anglos, right? And that means that the other 60% are people of color, you know, Latinos, Asians, African American, et cetera. And so the Republicans, I call them the haters, by the way, okay? All the haters out there, they're putting a lot of money into the Latino community. especially among men and women, and they're really espousing how evil abortion is, right? And they're making headways, unfortunately, because we have a lot of people that have come into the United States that are immigrants, and again, like myself, who were raised, Catholics or come from other evangelical or other religions, and so they are making some headways, and they have been able to get a few people elected. But when the poll was done, the surprising thing that they found out is that 63% of Latina women support abortion rights for women, okay? And it even goes further than that. Because when they talk about voting and voting on the issue of abortion, for women, it goes up to 83%, okay? So, I mean, they're spending a lot of money in there. They're getting a few people out there. But at the end of the day, we know that we as women are going to be able to win. And they're afraid of that. But I think it's just amazing when you think that in our country, the women are going to save democracy, okay? Think about that. And we can thank Ms. Magazine for that.
Kathy, I just want to add on to that. When we think about that data, one of the things that underlies what we saw with the midterm elections and what you're talking about happens to be how women love fiercely their daughters. Because if you look at the rhetoric right after Dobbs and those model states' laws that were triggered, so these red states had already passed laws that had not gone into effect because Roe was still the law of the land and Planned Parenthood v. Casey. But those laws that they had passed would ban abortion outright or ban abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy with no exceptions for rape or incest. So as soon as Dobbs and Roe falls, these laws were triggered into effect. And you had lawmakers beating their chests like, yeah, no exceptions, no exceptions. And then here's a case of a 10-year-old girl who is in Ohio and needs to make her way to Indiana. And these lawmakers beating their chest and saying, it's a hoax, she doesn't exist. And then others saying, well, even if she did exist, so what? And think about the mothers all across the country. Those mothers who had to think, if that's my child, and it happened because of a neighbor or someone in our family, and I'm going to let this person dictate what the future is for my 10-year-old, for my 11-year-old, that's exactly right. It's a no way, not for my child. And I think that has driven a lot of folks, including women who otherwise might have thought differently, for themselves, but not for their daughters, to give their daughters a chance at life, because that's what that really does, right? So
Exactly. And in fact, the Ohio case became the motivating factor for physicians in Ohio who took the lead to get on the ballot there this November a constitutional amendment to guarantee access to reproductive health care services in Ohio, including abortion and contraception. And they really led the effort to get it on the ballot. So that's happening this November. But there's other states that are already looking at ballot measures. Ellie, do you want to? Yeah, it's a way that everybody's fighting back. You got to use your mic.
She's doing that on purpose, She's our foil up here.
Yeah. Anyway, right now it might be in 7 more states, either those that are more restricting abortion and those that are legalizing and making it a fundamental right, making it a constitutional right. So 7 more states we think will be like Ohio. And right now, just remember, there's now been several states have voted. Didn't matter if they're red or blue, they were on the side of abortion rights for women. And so we have a wonderful, it started with Kansas, it went on to Kentucky, it's where they thought they were going to get people to vote on their way. Well, forget that one. So anyway, we expect it to be on the ballot. We're doing very well. By the way, our Feminist Majority Foundation organizes campuses. We're right now on 11 campuses. We're going to 15 in Ohio. So basically, Do you know how many physicians signed on? This is the one that gets me. Over 14,000 physicians in Ohio signed on. Three women OBGYN started the movement to put it into the ballot. And before they know it, the 3 had gone to 40 to 50. Anyway, they're at 14,000. We should start letting, physicians know a hell of a lot more about this than moralizing false political people. Who should make the decision? Women with the help of the medical, not the courts.
Or just women, just like women,
Right.
Exactly.
So we want to get to audience question and answers here, but I'd like to wrap this part of the conversation by asking each of you, this 50 Years of Ms. book contains a lot of information on a lot of different issues. And the question is, what lessons can we take from the last 50 years to build an even bigger movement and even faster we move forward than we have so far? So, Carmen, a millennial feminist, why don't you start this conversation?
Sure. And I think for me, as I've been making my way through the book, we've had so many people at events like these say, how frustrated they are that it feels like here we are celebrating 50 years of Ms. and relitigating so many of the same issues and having so many of the same conversations. But I feel like I've been putting a little spin on that, which is that to go through this collection as someone who has basically watched as women have fewer rights now than they did when I was born, feeling like we're going back into a place I don't understand, that I don't know from experience. And what I see in the collection, what I see in the 50 Years of Ms., and what I've seen working with you and Ellie and Michele and Dolores and all of these incredible feminist leaders in my career is that what we're going through is not unprecedented. And that means that we have answers and we have solutions and we do have a path forward. And that path is inside these pages and inside, the pages to come in Ms. And the articles to come and the podcasts to come. And just knowing that it comes from us providing that forum for ideas. I don't think of Ms. necessarily as prescriptive. I see it as this place where feminists come together to engage in good faith conversation with one another about how we can do better by one another, how we can be in solidarity with each other, about the commonalities of our lives and the differences in our lives, the things that other folks might not understand about our experiences that they can begin to understand when we tell our stories. And so I think for me, it's about making sure that, much like what you'll see in the book, that we have this inclusive, diverse, a multiracial coalition of women across backgrounds and experiences and orientations and ways of the world coming together to find solutions, to name problems, and to raise hell. I think that's the way forward.
There we go.
Indeed. Dolores, how are we going to move forward? What, from the last 50 years, the lessons?
Well, for the OGs like me, I can remember the time when the only women's magazines were Good Housekeeping, right? A Ladies' Home Journal, and here you have this radical magazine that comes out called Ms. MS, And to me, because it changed my life, I have to say that very definitely. And to me, Ms. is a movement, okay? It's not a magazine. It's an inspiration. And as I said before, it's a blueprint for feminism. And it often in Ms. Magazine, there are things that are brought out in Ms. Magazine that at a moment nobody's thinking about them. Or if they are thinking about them, and I think going back in time, I can remember to talk about domestic violence. You didn't do that in public, That is something that you kept very, very quiet in your own family. And to talk about domestic violence in front of other people and all of these things that women have suffered but have been silent. that you couldn't talk about them, and then you couldn't write about them. And so, to me, Ms. Magazine is, again, it's going to be always on the vanguard. It's going to be futuristic. They talked about the morning after pill, which they had it in Europe, but we didn't have it here. And had it not been for Ellie and Peg Yorkin and Kathy, it never would have been brought to the United States of America. How many people know that? Very few people know that. And so here you have the history of the women's movement, but also the kind of tools that we need as a late blooming feminist like myself, or born again feminists, and the things that we need to do the work that we need to do in our country, in our society, in our communities. And so I just say that Ms., as I said before, it's our map, it's our blueprint, and we can look forward to many more great things. And one more thing that we haven't talked that much about is it brings women of the world together, okay? Because in Ms. Magazine, we're not just talking about the United States. We're talking about things that are going on in other parts of the world, the way that women are being treated, and that we know that we have to do more. Because the United States of America is the most powerful country in the world. And so when we liberate women here in the United States, we know we have to liberate women in other parts of the world. Si se puede.
There we go. I mean, just to say ditto to all of that. When I think about this, Kathy, I think about how we hold on to what comes next. In some ways, what I've been articulating is that we need a third Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction that abolished slavery, gave us equal protection under the laws, voting rights, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And an interesting time where it was the first time that we saw black lawmakers elected to Congress, and we're talking about the 1800s. And then it died with separate but equal. The Supreme Court killed it, just like with Dobbs. And then we see in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, a series of laws that elevated all Americans, but clearly much of that was about women and people of color in this country. And then we've seen that be chipped away at. And so I think about that next coming, and really the question being, how do we hold on to it? And that's where I think the ingredients will actually be found quite seriously in the pages of Ms. and on the podcast that we're bringing out to the public. That kind of forecasting about what do we need to do in order to achieve these next steps, and then what does it take to hold on to them, which I think is really the critical question for us, because the pendulum will swing. But then our duty is to figure out just how we hold on.
Right, exactly. Ellie, lessons that will propel us forward faster.
Well,
Okay, use your mic.
I'll get to it.
Right.
I think that one of the things that we say over and over again in the magazine and in the cover, anger plus rage equals power. And I think the big lesson is you got to take power. You got to take power and being comfortable with power. We were the only people that put the first woman speaker, Nancy Pelosi, on the cover. Time magazine had put her opponent on the cover several times. She wasn't on it until she actually got to the speaker. I think when a woman is attacked, we have to make sure that stops. The gender. And, I was thinking when you said this, Dolores, about a man beats up his wife. The wife should be shut up so it wouldn't be a disgrace for the family. And that was how we both were raised. I'm sure of that. It was a shame. Why didn't we talk? Why it was a big deal about the Feminist Majority in 72 printing about the 50 women on abortion? Because abortion was a swear word. Just remember, when I was growing up, it was a swear word. You're not supposed to say that word in public society. And we fell for it. We kept on talking about choice. What choice does that 10-year-old have? I mean, in other words, even us, who conscience is raised, we have to constantly raise that conscience and then we must take power. We cannot allow ourselves to be put down over and over and over again. And so we started with the Feminization of Power campaign when we launched the Feminist Majority. And we had, when we launched the Feminist Majority in 1987, 5% of the members of Congress were women. I never thought with 50 years later, or whatever it is, 38 years later, it would only still be 30%. We have got to take power, because I could say all the reasons, you know all the reasons. And I just want every one of you to, in this audience, think, what can I do? What can I do? And it has to happen in California and New York too. We can't take it for granted. We lost House seats in this state that we should never have lost. We lost 5 House seats, enough to put us over in New York, because we took it for granted. We can't take anything for granted.
And you think about the people that lost too, like a Santos.
To Santos.
Santos.
I know.
I know.
That's shameful.
That's shameful.
That's it.
Yeah. Questions? I think Hammer has.
Yeah, I think the ushers will.
Yeah, I think there's ushers with a microphone.
Santos. I know.
There's a hand raised over here.
Trump, the professional.
Oh, well, I mean, come on. Exactly. Doesn't know a gag rule, and it's, never mind.
Hello. Hi. I'm over here, the other way.
Okay. We can't see you is the problem.
I know.
But okay.
Ellie, first of all, thank you for the shout out to my hero, Martha Griffiths. I'm from Michigan, as you know, and it warmed my heart to hear her mentioned, because she is so forgotten. And I think we need that history. We need to know our own history. And that's why this is so important. The other thing I want to say is in the book, there's one of the first articles in Ms. Magazine. My mother was not a feminist. She was a devout Catholic, as I was, and she couldn't understand me. But the first article in Ms. Magazine that I had my mother read was The Click. And it's about what happens to women when they realize, oh, that's what those women's libbers, as we were called at the time, that's what they're talking about. They had some earth-shattering revelation. Catholics call it an epiphany, but it's that same thing. And I would recommend everybody here buy the book and show that to that article. If you don't appreciate it, you know somebody who will. So please share it. And thank you so much for this. I'm so happy to see you, and I'm happy to be here. And I think it's wonderful that Ms. is taking this book tour. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Actually, Jane O'Reilly, who wrote that article, The Housewife's Moment of Truth, joined us in Boston earlier this week at our big event there. So we're making the trip around the country. We probably just have time for one more, right?
Thank you. So I'm a professor of gender studies here at UCLA. I don't know if any of my I wish there were more of my people here. This is kind of my question, First of all, for me, as a professor of gender studies, I'm just so beside myself with joy at this panel of all my wonderful heroes. It's extraordinary. And yeah, my heart is a little sad that this hasn't been more of a collaboration. You know what I'm saying? So I just want to say 2 things. One is that I'm so glad that you foregrounded issues like this ERA, which I'm feeling it. We got to get it passed. Reproductive justice couldn't, be more vital. it's also true that after 50 years nearly from the first women's studies program, there are now states in the US that would like to cancel us, along with Afro-Am and a whole bunch of other most cutting edge disciplines. And I know how important it is to Ms., the collaborations with the universities and the work that you're doing with the students. And I hope that you could add that in as you continue on the book tour to let people know that we are under serious threat. You know, we're not going to be here if people aren't standing up for us. So that is my message to you, and I just want to say that I am happy to be the emissary of a message to the folks in gender studies, because I do believe an injustice is done in the way that we teach what Ms. was and is, insofar as it's, I believe, if you asked most people, considered like the apex of the second wave, which maybe isn't doing justice to either the second wave or where we're at now. So this is my way of saying I really think the time has come for some renewed encounter to get some of this stuff hashed out. And I'm so happy to be here for this first, what I hope, conversation.
That's why we're here, is to bring feminists together with renewed energy to fight forward. We'll be at the National Women's Studies Association at the end of October, their annual conference in Baltimore, and many gender and women's studies faculty write for Ms. You'll see their names in Ms., and it's so critical that Ms. is used in the classrooms as a teaching text, but also that many women in gender studies scholars write for the magazine and write for the website, because the ideas in the academy need to be shared with a very broad audience, and Ms. believes very deeply that's one of our missions. So thank you for the work that you do.
And Kathy, if I could just add on to that, to your point about where's the crowd. It has so often been the case that of our most fundamental movements in the United States, that it's been a core group that's led it. We imagine that there are just myriads and myriads. When Dr. King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, he was speaking about isolation. He was speaking about how others should be there, but aren't. And then when we imagine in the past, like the crowds and whatnot, but so often, and that's been the story of Ms., right, itself, being a pioneer, being a leader when even others were not strong enough to do that, but Ms. stood the time and the test and courageously did that. And each one of these women here on this stage in their own way, just courageously leading from that core, that heart, that spirit from within. Yeah. So thank you all, and thank you all so much.
Thank you. So we'll see you yes.
In the courtyard?
Yeah. Go ahead, Dolores. Have the last word. Dolores?
I was just going to say we're going to the courtyard.
Let Dolores have the last word. Go ahead, Dolores.
No, I was just going to say, can we do the chant?
Oh, of course, yes.
Okay, so this is what because we know Ms. is about courage, right? It's about leadership, but it's about empowerment. And we know that we as women and feminists, okay, the feminist men in the room, that we have to be the leaders. We have to save democracy. And what I would like to have everybody in the room stand up for a second, if we can. So then I'm going to ask you this question, two questions actually. And the first question I'm going to ask you who's got the power? And I want you to say, we've got the power, okay? Second question, what kind of power? We're going to say feminist power, okay? Can we do that? But we want to shout it really loud so that the haters can hear us. So let's go, everybody. Who's got the power?
We've got the power!
What kind of power?
Feminist power!
All right, are we going to use our power to save democracy, to save women?
Yes!
Okay, let's say the chant, this chant, I kind of started this, and President Obama took it, and he called it Yes We Can. And in Spanish, it's Si Se Puede. And when I met President Obama, the first thing he said to me, he said, I stole your slogan. And I told him, yes, you did. Yes, you did. Okay, so maybe we could all do the chant, Yes We Can, but we can do it in Spanish. Si Se Puede. Let's go. Okay, so let's do it, everybody, with an organized hand clap. Let's go. Si se puede. Are we going to use our power? What do we say?
Si se puede.
Okay, let's all go with an organized clap. Si se puede. Let's go. Si se puede.
Si se puede.
And then let's do a big viva for all the women here, all of the pioneers, the ones that really, they're the ones that cut the road out there for all of us and able to also transform us, transform them and giving us the courage. And so let's say a big old viva for Ms. Magazine, okay? Que viva Ms.
Viva Ms.
Que viva, just say viva, okay? Que viva Ms. Viva! Que viva Ms. Viva! Thank you.